In this video, we're going to talk about brush pens and water brushes. These versatile, portable tools allow artists to use brushes without extra water, an inkwell, or even a palette, making them perfect for sketching outside of the studio. Over the years, I've amassed quite a collection of them, and my plan is to show them to you, demonstrate a few different ways you can use them to sketch, and along the way, give you some purchasing recommendations. First, what is the difference between a brush pen and a water brush? They're very similar, both having a reservoir in the handle that provides a steady flow of ink or water to the brush tip. Generally, brush pens are designed for line work, whereas water brushes are designed for washes. But that's not always the case, since some water brushes have wide brush tips that can also be used for washes. Most water brushes have flexible handles that allow you to push extra water into the brush tip, but this feature also exists in many brush pens. The main difference, of course, is that the brush pen is filled with ink, whereas the water brush is filled with water. But even this distinction is blurred by the fact that you can put ink into your water brush, turning it into a brush pen, and conversely, put water in your brush pen, turning it into a water brush. First, let's talk brush pens. These fall into two major categories: pens that use a felt tip and pens that are tipped with hair. We're not going to talk about the ones with felt tips because, in my opinion, they're not really brush pens at all, but just pointy markers. Those of you that follow my channel know that I spend a lot of time talking about fountain pens with flexible nibs and the importance of line variation in drawing. A brush pen can create a larger variety of lines than a flex pen can produce, and can put down thick and thin lines in every direction, as opposed to the flex pen, which can only put down a thicker line on the downstroke. What's more, a brush pen can also be used to create a lot of different textures that a pen cannot even approach. And yes, brush pens can even be used for fine hatching. Here are the brush pens in my collection. This one is a Pentel portable pocket brush. These three are Pentel art brushes in black, gray, and sepia. These are pocket brushes made by Kuretake, both black and white. These three are all Kuretake fountain brush pens, number 13. This one is also a Kuretake brush pen, number 30. And lastly, one that's not quite as well known, a Youngshin 3009. Let's start off with this Pentel pocket brush. This is the first brush pen that I bought, and it seemed really expensive at the time at a whopping $17. It came with a few of these ink cartridges filled with black waterproof ink. These cartridges are proprietary, meaning that you can't use cartridges from other brands, but that's not a huge hindrance since these Pentel cartridges are widely available and relatively inexpensive at about $7 for 12 pieces. And since the cartridges are large, you won't have to refill all that often. The pen body is plastic and is a nice size and weight, comfortable to hold, having a snap-on cap that posts securely without off-balancing the pen. The brush comes to a very sharp point that is held up well after several years of use, and the flow is quite good, so that even if you're working very fast, the brush keeps up, keeping the stroke crisp. The pen is not without problems, however, the main one being that it's very hard to control. It's fine when just doing line work, but if I try to hatch, I can't maintain a consistent thickness and the lines get very sloppy. You can still do good work with it, however, if you're only using it for outlines. I think it's particularly good for landscape, where this really delicate brush can be used to suggest all kinds of organic textures. The second important drawback is that it only uses Pentel cartridges. The ink in them is nice, really black, that dries quickly and leaves no residue, but I like using a variety of different inks, not just black, so for me, this is a relatively big limitation. Here are two little sketches that I did with this brush pen in combination with watercolor. As you can see, it's capable of putting down quite a nice delicate line and works well on watercolor paper. While I prefer the greater control of a pen to do my line work, for small energetic sketches where precision is not a priority, I think this Pentel pocket brush is a nice choice. The next brush pen, the Kuretake number 13 fountain brush, I like even more. For one thing, the hairs are stiffer, making it easier to control. With the Pentel pocket brush, I could not create regular cross-hatching. With this one, I can without problems. The other advantage is that instead of using only cartridges, this one takes either cartridges or a converter made by Platinum, which allows you to use whatever fountain pen ink you want. This is why I have three of these, each filled with different dilutions of Noodler's Black. This one is filled with black, this one is filled with a light gray, and this one is filled with a midtone. These little pens are great for doing small sketches. Sometimes I'll crosshatch with them, like this sketch, and then sometimes I use them to sketch landscapes. In this little sketch, I'm using the Kuretake pens filled with different dilutions of ink, and also controlling the values through dry brushing. This works well because the flow of the pen is dry enough so that when I work fast, the ink scrapes against the surface of the paper, creating a fuzzy stroke. Since the diluted ink is transparent, I can build up the values gradually, and as I work towards the foreground, switch to the pen filled with a darker ink, introducing more texture and contrast. This is a fast, portable technique, a little limited in terms of range or value, but for quick sketches when you don't need a high degree of finish, quite effective. This is the more expensive version of the Kuretake number 13, the Kuretake number 40. It's heavier than the number 13, featuring a metal body, and the brush in this one is made from natural red sable instead of nylon. Allow me to save you a few bucks and tell you that there is no difference in performance between the cheaper synthetic brush and this one. Sable brushes usually have two significant advantages over synthetics. The first is that they're able to hold more water or ink. This is important for a regular brush because it means you don't have to reload your brush as often. But with this pen, there's a constant flow of ink from the reservoir, so there's no need for the hair to hold additional water. The second advantage is that sable hairs are snappier, making it easier to go from thick and thin lines. But the hairs in these brush tips are so short that both the synthetic and the sable have an equal amount of snapback. Therefore, since all the advantages of a sable brush are negated, don't think twice about getting the cheaper model, which in the US will only run you about 13 bucks. Unfortunately, if you want to use this brush with a platinum converter, it'll run you an additional $10. Up next we have these three Pentel art brushes, which I believe I bought in a single set. The black brush has a very black ink in it. The gray one has a mid-tone gray that is transparent, allowing you to add layers and make it darker. The sepia brush is very dark, almost a warm black rather than brown. Instead of using cartridges or converters, the entire handle of this brush is filled with ink, giving it a huge ink capacity. All three brushes are very snappy and have excellent flow, and the great thing about them is that by squeezing the handle, you add extra ink, making the brush wetter. The ink in them is very soluble in water, which is nice because you can use them in combination with a water brush to add soft transitions in value. These have really nice, very sharp brush tips, which are larger than the ones in the Pentel pocket brush and the Kuretake fountain brush, but can still be used to create very fine, consistent lines. This allows me to do cross-hatching the same way I would with a pen. In this figure drawing, I'm starting off with a gray pen. The hatching here can be quite fine and be built up little by little. Toward the end of the drawing, I add accents with black in the hair and a few places that go darker. You can get fairly strong darks with just the gray alone if you layer it, but I think the black adds a nice additional contrast to the drawing. These brush pens also have a number of disadvantages, the first being their size. They're too long to fit into any of my pen cases. The second issue is that these are not refillable, so when you run out of ink, you'll have to buy another ink-filled handle. They aren't expensive at about $5 for two, and they carry a lot of ink, but the fact that you have to dispose of this chunk of plastic and replace it with another one seems wasteful. There is a hack that allows you to refill these, which was demonstrated by Teo Yi Che on his excellent channel. It requires a few simple steps and allows you to fill these pens with whatever ink you desire. I'll leave a link below to that tutorial for those who are interested. Then we have these brush pens made by Kuretake, which are similar to the ones made by Pentel, with almost identical brush width, flow, and degree of control, but also with the same problems, their unwieldy size and the fact that you have to replace the entire handle when you run out of ink. The only difference between them seems to be that the Kuretake uses waterproof ink, while the Pentel are water-soluble. Allow me to save you some money and tell you that the white is not terribly good, too transparent to work on anything but black paper. I would not buy one. The last brush pen I'd like to show you is this very cool Yong-shing 3009. Unlike other brush pens that use either cartridges or converters, this one features a built-in piston mechanism giving two advantages, a very large ink capacity and the ability to use the ink of your choice. These are cheaply constructed with wiggly parts, but they actually work well. The flow is wetter than the Kuretake fountain brushes, and the hairs on these are actually pretty bouncy and sharp and easy to control. This, for me, if the build quality was better, would be the perfect brush pen. If somebody created a high-quality version of this, I would be very, very happy. By the way, these pens are normally completely clear. I used a marker to color code this one because I have three of them, each filled with a different dilution of ink. Okay, now on to water brushes. I used to dislike these wonderful little tools, preferring the far better control of regular brushes. However, as I've gotten more and more into quick sketching, I've come around. Their convenience and portability make up for their faults, and with practice and a few tricks that I'm going to show you, they can become an invaluable sketching tool. Sadly, I don't have a full panoply of brands of water brushes to show you. All I have are these Pentel water brushes in different sizes: small, medium, and large. This is a very popular brand, however, and I strongly recommend them. The brush tips on them are very nice and sharp, not as springy as the ones on the Pentel art brushes, but good enough, and the overall length is short enough so that they fit into most pen cases. The water capacity is very decent, allowing you to carry enough water for small sketches. There are quite a few ways to use water brushes. Probably the most popular is to use them with watercolors. Just squeeze the handle to wet the brush, using it to transfer some paint onto the palette. And then, as you work the paint on the palette, add as much additional water as needed to get the concentration of color that you want. Getting a feel for how much to squeeze takes a bit of practice, and there's a little bit of delay between when you squeeze and when the water actually arrives to the brush. If you're not used to this, you'll end up squeezing too much and over-diluting your washes. To clean the brush, squeeze out some additional water and wipe the brush on an absorbent paper towel. The paper towel is absolutely essential here because it'll allow you to dry off the brush if it gets too wet, and is also used to mop up mistakes. This is something that you can usually do with a regular brush by drying it off and using it like a sponge to soak up areas where the wash starts to run, or to lighten your washes. Since the water brush is always wet, the only way to do this is with a paper towel. Here's a quick demo of how this is done with a water brush. I've already inked this drawing a little, and now I'm applying the washes with my brush. One important piece of advice is not to go too small with your palette, since having enough mixing area to properly dilute your washes is super important, as is mixing enough wash to cover the area that you want. There are a few other ways of using the water brush, however. For example, if you're using an ink that is semi-waterproof, such as this Noodler's Brown, you can create a wash after you put down the lines by going over them with a water brush. You have to choose your ink carefully for this technique to work. If the ink is too waterproof, it won't create a wash. If the ink is water-soluble, the lines will wash away. You need to find an ink that only partially dissolves, but still retains a crisp line. I have a tutorial where I explain this technique in detail, the link to which I'll leave below. This is a nice portable technique that only requires two tools, a pen and a water brush, and doesn't even need a palette. I really like using this technique with Noodler's Brown because the wash has some very pretty color variations and gives the drawing a slightly antique feel. A similar technique involves using the water brush and a pen filled with waterproof ink. After inking my lines, I simply take ink directly from the nib with my water brush. With a little practice, I can actually control the value of my washes by taking ink from different parts of the nib and controlling the wetness of the brush. If I want a very light wash, I saturate my brush by squeezing the handle and then take ink from the tip of the nib. If I want to go darker, I can dry off my brush slightly and take ink from the breather hole. You can also increase the ink flow to the nib by holding the pen facing down, which will result in very dark washes. If a wash is too dark, you can just squeeze extra water into the wash and dilute it before it dries onto the paper. This is a really fun, quick way of working, utilizing only two drawing tools to get what I think are pretty cool results. Another neat thing that you can do is fill the entire water brush with ink, essentially turning your water brushes into brush pens. This works quite well with very generous flow, though the hairs on these brushes are a touch floppy and slightly more difficult to control than the Pentel art brush. The great thing about this is that you can use the ink of your choice and can even premix a few different values of ink, say a light gray, a medium, and a dark. For this sketch, I have a water brush filled with undiluted Noodler's Black and one filled with water. I'm using the ink-filled water brush as an ink reservoir, similar to the way I was using the pen in the previous sketch. I find that I have a little bit more control with this method, however, and I'm able to use the ink-filled water brush to put down strong areas of dark towards the end of the drawing. This technique requires two water brushes and a pen, so it's slightly less compact, but I think for the added versatility, it's worth taking along that second brush. I hope you found this overview of brush pens and water brushes useful. They're an indispensable part of my portable sketching kit, greatly increasing the variety of work that I can do outside of my studio. I'm still exploring the many fun ways they can be used to draw, and I hope this video sparks your interest in doing your own exploration. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll be happy to reply.